All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a genuinely fascinating story about how a completely ordinary, run-of-the-mill traffic accident in Angeles City somehow managed to transform into a massive, landmark Supreme Court case. I mean, it's incredibly rare that a simple midnight fender bender completely overhauls how an entire country handles vehicular accident laws, but that is exactly what happened in the case of Francis Morales versus the people of the Philippines. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how one really bad driving decision forced the highest court in the land to literally rewrite the rules of the road.
So you've got to wonder, how does a 3 a.m. fender bender change Philippine law forever? Well, to answer that, we have to start by zooming in on the human element. Just imagine it, a dark road in the middle of the night. A split-second decision is made, you hear the crunch of metal, and suddenly lives are completely interrupted. It's a tragedy that happens every single day. But we're going to zoom out and see how this specific unfortunate moment collided with decades of really confusing legal precedents. It actually forced the justice system to finally answer a question that had been keeping lawyers awake at night for years. How exactly do we punish a driver when one single mistake ends up hurting multiple people?
Okay, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First up, we'll look at the midnight crash. Then, the doctrine clash. Next, we'll be unpacking Article 48 before looking closely at the en banc decision, and finally, we'll wrap up with the final verdict.
Let's get things off with Part 1, the midnight crash. So paint this picture in your head. It's 3 a.m. on May 15, 2013. Francis Morales is driving his Mitsubishi Delica van down Stordo Rosario Street in Angeles City. He's heading home after a night out. And then, in a split-second decision, he hastily decides to overtake the vehicle right in front of him. But the problem? He does it completely blindly, swerving straight into the opposite lane. The impact is absolutely immediate. He collides head-on with an Isuzu passenger jeepney driven by a man named Rico Mendoza. The aftermath is a mess. Rico, his wife Leilani, and another passenger named Myrna all suffer physical injuries, and the jeepney itself is severely damaged. Looking at the timeline, it establishes one undeniable fact. Morales' reckless overtaking in the dark was the direct, undeniable cause of this collision.
Because of this crash, Morales got hit with a mouthful of a charge: reckless imprudence resulting in damage to property and multiple physical injuries. But what does that actually mean in plain English? Well, we have to look at the specific elements of the crime. Reckless imprudence happens when you voluntarily do an act, like, say, deciding to overtake a car. You do it without malice, meaning you didn't set out with the intention of hurting anyone. Material damage results, so people get hurt and cars get smashed. And finally, there is an inexcusable lack of precaution. That last point, it simply translates to plain old recklessness. Morales just didn't make sure the opposite lane was actually clear before he swerved. Now here's the kicker. When the collision happened, Morales was straight up occupying the wrong side of the road. Under Philippine civil law, if you are violating a traffic regulation at the exact moment of a mishap, the law automatically presumes you are negligent. You do not get the benefit of the doubt. Morales actually tried to argue that the jeepney driver had the last clear chance to avoid him, but the courts completely rejected that. The presumption of negligence stood firm because, at the end of the day, he was driving in a lane he literally had no business being in.
Moving right along to Part 2, the doctrine clash.
Once Morales was convicted, the lower courts suddenly found themselves with a massive headache. They genuinely didn't know how to punish him. Why? Because the Supreme Court itself had two completely conflicting rulings on the books at the same time. On one side, you had the 2001 De Los Santos Doctrine. This basically said that reckless imprudence is just a way of committing a crime, meaning you could lump multiple injuries together into one big, complex crime. But on the other side, you had the 2010 Ivler Doctrine, which firmly ruled that reckless imprudence is actually a distinct, completely separate crime of its own. This meant you cannot group the consequences together. Lower courts across the country were utterly confused about which rule they were supposed to follow.
Which brings us to Part 3, unpacking Article 48.
Let's define the battleground here. We're talking about Article 48 of the Revised Penal Code, which deals with what they call complex crimes. Now, Article 48 is a rule that says if a single act causes two or more grave or less grave offenses, you only face a single prosecution, and you're only given the single maximum penalty for the most serious crime. It was basically designed as a procedural tool to benefit the accused. So, the million-dollar question for Francis Morales was this: does Article 48 apply to traffic accidents caused by negligence? I like to think of Article 48 as the bundle deal. Under the old De Los Santos rule, if you hit 3 people in one crash, your charges get bundled together and you serve just one penalty. It's a package.
But the Ivler Doctrine argued that quasi-crimes, which are crimes of negligence under Article 365, must be treated à la carte, meaning every single consequence of your actions gets its own separate penalty. If you hit 3 people and smash a car, you get punished for victim 1, then you get punished for victim 2, then victim 3, and then again for the car damage. No discounts.
That takes us to part 4, the En-Bank decision.
This right here, this is the Supreme Court's absolute mic drop moment. To clear up the mess, the court en banc declared, once and for all, De Los Santos is abandoned. We agree with our pronouncements in Ivler. Article 48 does not apply to quasi-offenses. They gave dramatic, heavy weight to the ruling that reckless imprudence is its own distinct crime. It's not just a modality or a way of committing an intentional felony. It is punished entirely based on the lack of care, not the intent. Therefore, you absolutely cannot use the Article 48 bundle deal for traffic accidents.
So, the absolute bottom line here is this: no more bundle deals. Every single injury and piece of damaged property gets penalized separately. And why does this matter to you and me? It's simple. If you drive recklessly today, you do not get a discount on your sentence just because all the damage happened in one single crash. You will be held completely accountable for every individual person you hurt and every single piece of property you destroy. And finally, Part 5, the final verdict.
So back to Morales. When the Supreme Court looked at the actual injuries sustained by the jeepney passengers, they noted that Rico, Leilani, and Myrna only required a few days of medical confinement. Now, under the law, this translates strictly to slight physical injuries. Because they're considered slight, they get classified as a light felony. And because they're a light felony, the penalty for Morales actually drops drastically. The law specifically reduces penalties for reckless acts that result in minor injuries, basically to preserve the difference between doing something by accident versus doing it on purpose. So let's break down exactly how this a la carte system hits Morales' wallet, rather than giving him one bundled jail sentence. For Rico and Leilani's slight injuries, Morales receives a penalty of public censure, plus he has to pay 8,000 pesos in temperate damages. For Myrna, that's another separate public censure and 2,000 pesos. And finally, for the jeepney owner, Noel Garcia, Morales is hit with a totally separate 150,000 peso fine for the property damage, plus he has to pay 150,000 pesos in damages. Oh, and all of these monetary awards are subject to a 6% annual interest until they're fully paid off. Every single thing is calculated completely separately. To wrap up this explainer, we've seen how one really reckless decision at 3 a.m. literally forced the justice system to untangle decades of legal confusion. The Morales case proves that the law no longer hands out bulk discounts for negligence. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. If a single moment of recklessness brings a lifetime of separate, unbundled penalties, how will this landmark ruling change the way you share the road? Understanding the sheer weight of this law makes us all a little safer and definitely a whole lot more accountable. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.